the recording. And then we'll begin here with session number 3 of Biblical Backgrounds. We'll be looking at the concept of Israel as the land between. We sometimes speak of Israel as occupying a land bridge between Africa and the Eurasian landmass. And that's not just a figure of speech. I want you to see the effect that geography has on the way the Bible unfolded. An awful lot of the things that happen in the Bible are dependent on the place and the interaction of the parts of the world that are involved in the Bible are important. They're always important. And it helps us to see what's coming. So I'm going to share the screen here. Let me see if I can do this without messing myself up. Okay. Here we go. Sometimes this, there we go. It actually came up. So that's obviously Google Maps. And this is a picture of the world as it existed in biblical times. Prior to about the time of the Renaissance Reformation, people didn't even know that the Western Hemisphere existed. There were some people living there, of course, but no great cities and no great civilizations. The civilizations that did exist in the Western Hemisphere were small and generally primitive, although some of them interesting in their own right, but they didn't affect the history of the world. The history of the world, the great civilizations of the world happen on this map. And you can see Africa to the southwest, Asia to the northeast, and Europe to the northwest. And there in the middle, that great big landmass in the middle, is Saudi Arabia. And if you're looking for Israel, you're going to have to look very, very closely. Something that most people miss is that Israel is a very small place. It's not at all big. You can probably find Italy on this map on the left-hand side of the globe out there in the Mediterranean Sea. Italy is not a very big place, but it's about 50 times the size of Israel. You can probably see just a smidgen of the Philippines on the far eastern side, the right-hand side of this map. If you can find, let's see, Vietnam is there. It's the other side of the South China Sea. We're going to find the Philippines. So all of this landmass is to some extent involved in the biblical story. So North Africa, Europe and Asia, as it faces the Mediterranean or as it faces what we call Central Asia. Those areas are all fairly well involved. Now, we're going to start our story not right at the creation. We will get back to some creation mythology in the other countries, but I want first of all to start off with the way civilization originally developed in the world. And this is described for us in the book of Genesis in chapters 6 through 9 with the flood. When the flood happened, the entire earth was reprocessed. All of the surface features changed. Nothing before the flood survived except Noah and his family on the ark. And Noah landed that ark in a place called Ararat. Sometimes that is called Urartu. It's the same place, it's just different vowels. And the mountains of Ararat, if you look closely at what's going on there, are between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. The nation that probably contains most of the right area where Noah may have landed is called Armenia. Right on the borders between Armenia and Turkey would be the mountains of Ararat. And all of that is high mountains, very rugged. It was the northern reaches of the Mesopotamian Valley. When Noah landed on the mountains of Ararat, he had a choice. He could, of course, have gone west and would rapidly, well, not too rapidly, but it would have taken several days of travel to come to the shores of the Black Sea, and there was nothing there particularly. He could have gone east and run into the Caspian Sea. He could have gone north, and as he did, he would have noticed that the weather was getting colder and colder the farther north he went, and it would have been a hard trip. Or he could have followed the river, whatever river he landed near, to the south, and that would have taken him into Mesopotamia, or the valley of the Tigris and Euphrates River. Now, this would have been attractive for Noah and his family because obviously it's warmer. The water is abundant and very predictable. It would have been a relatively fertile, green place, and frankly, an easy place to live. Everything grows in Mesopotamia. It's got a long growing season. You don't have to worry about freezing in the winter. It's actually a fairly comfortable place to live. Now, it is bounded by a high plateau to the east, which we call Persia or Iran, and it's bounded by the great Arabian Desert to the west. But the Tigris-Euphrates Valley itself is quite fertile. It's well watered. There's easy living to be had just about everywhere in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. Noah and his family ended up moving toward the south east end of the Tigris and Euphrates Valley, where the two rivers come together at the confluence. This area in the Bible is called Shinar. The modern scholars who have done archaeology here call the place Sumer. The earliest civilization on the planet seems to have been at Sumer. But written language is going to begin happening in three places simultaneously. The Tower of Babel, described for us in chapter 11 of Genesis, probably happened in Sumer, probably somewhere in this region where Noah's three sons first settled. Babel may be associated with Babylon. That's a possibility, although we don't know. That's one of the traditions, but it's probably fairly close to this region that we call Sumer. When the language was confused, the three groups, which would be three tribal units by this time, went their own separate directions. Shem stayed in the Middle East. They're in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. Ham headed south and found the river Nile. And so Egypt was founded by the Hamites. Japheth, the third son, headed to the east. He crossed the Persian Plateau, he crossed Afghanistan, and found eventually the other side of the Hindu Kush, the Indus Valley of India. Those three areas are the earliest three civilizations that we can identify on the planet. Now, shortly after, we do have a civilization in China along the Yellow River. But the Indus, the Tigris Euphrates, and the Nile are the first three civilizational centers. The Tigris Euphrates Valley was characterized by a people group that we call Semitic, named after Shem. The Nile Valley characterizes a group of languages that are found in Africa that we call Hamitic, named after Ham. The Indus Valley is going to be inhabited by people who spoke Sanskrit. The earliest language that we find in India is Sanskrit in the old Vedic literature. And the Sanskrit is the basis or the great-great-grandfather of a group of languages that we call Indo-European. The Indo-European languages are the majority of languages on the planet. Everything from Greek and Latin in the West to Tibetan and Hindi and Urdu, the various Chinese dialects. Mandarin, for example, is related to the Sanskrit. So those languages began at Sumer at the Tower of Babel and went their different directions. The earliest three written languages are Sanskrit, the Semitic language of Sumerian, and Hamitic, where we're going to get hieroglyphics in the Nile Valley. All of the modern languages can be traced to these three original language groups from about 5,500 years ago, give or take a little bit. The earliest languages that we can trace seem to be about 33 to 3,500 BC. And before that, there doesn't seem to be a written language. Now, people still talk to each other, but the writing of language seems to have been invented in these three places at about the same time. And that's a very interesting thing, trying to explain how three great language groups evolved from a single beginning point is really, really difficult without the story of the Tower of Babel. With the Tower of Babel as an explanation, this makes perfectly good sense. If you compare, if today, as a speaker of an Indo-European language, you decide to learn ancient hieroglyphic Egyptian, you would find many, many challenges. It's actually a very difficult language. It represents a different culture and a different way of thinking. Really, language, spoken language and written language, represents the way a people group think. It's not just symbols on a page. It's the representation of how people think, at how their logic works. The Hamitic, Semitic, and Indo-European languages are different from one another at a primitive level, at an essential low level, at the level of what a computer would call machine language. So that makes it difficult to go from one language group to another. Now, I know Greek, And that made the little bit of Sanskrit that I tried to pick up fairly easy. And because I know Greek, Latin was not hard. And because I know Latin, Italian is really pretty simple, and so is Spanish, and French is not far off. All of those languages are related, but learning Hebrew was difficult. Learning Arabic is even harder. And those two are Semitic languages. Okay, so that's the fundamental thing. Then I'm going to let's zero in just a little bit. I'm going to zoom just a bit on the area of Israel itself. I've drawn a green circle around Israel so that you can kind of see where it is in relationship to everything else. There's a famous book introducing the geography of Israel called The Land Between. Dr. Monson 50 years ago wrote that thing, and it's unexcelled. He does an excellent job. But the key to understanding this is that Israel is a land bridge. A fellow called Anson Rainey recently did the Carta Biblical Atlas, and his title is The Sacred Bridge. When you look at Israel, it doesn't look like it's all that narrow a spot. As we get closer and zero in, you'll see what I mean by that. To the north, you can see all of the Eurasian landmass. There's Europe to the left, Asia to the right, and immediately north, Turkey, Persia, and Mesopotamia. To the south, Egypt. So let's get that line. There's Egypt in the south. That's actually, the circle is describing Egypt and what we call the Sudan, although that was all considered a part of Egypt. Then the Sudan leading down to Ethiopia was called Kush, but there's Egypt. And Egypt and the African continent are off to the south. If you were in, let's say, Turkey, and you wanted to go to Libya, the route would take you through Israel. There is no other route. You could go by sea, but actually in the ancient world, it was much more dangerous to go by sea. It was usually quicker to walk. So there's Egypt to the south. To the north, Turkey on the left, Mesopotamia, Persia, and then a bunch of smaller people groups. You'll notice how the Black Sea on the left forms the northern boundary of Turkey or Asia Minor. In the location where the mountains of Ararat are located, lots and lots of mountains. The mountain group as a whole is called the Caucasus Range, and it's high, snow-covered, difficult to travel through. It forms a natural barrier. To the right of the Caucasus range of mountains is the Caspian Sea, another major barrier. And then off to the right, the Great Central Asian Plateau, where a group of people eventually known as the Scythians are going to live. And the Scythians were all different sorts of people, nomadic people. The nomads lived over there. The Persian Plateau is just south of the Caspian Sea, running from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf. All of that brown-looking, stirred-up mass of desert is Persia. And it's actually quite a large area. And then immediately to the south of the north is the Arabian Desert. The Arabian Desert is virtually impassable. you'll notice how the left-hand side of the Arabian Peninsula has a little greener territory. That's land where sheep and goats can be pastured. There are places there where people do live. The name for that is Hijaz, and this is where Job was located. It's also, significantly enough, the location where Muhammad will come from. But generally speaking, the Arabian Desert forms a boundary. That starts about 20 miles, well, it would be 30 kilometers to the east of the Jordan River, and continues all the way across the Arabian Peninsula. It is an impassable barrier for people without modern transportation. In the ancient world, the nomads with their camels could get a distance, maybe 100 miles into the desert. And they did for trading and other purposes. But to cross the desert was never done. People who wanted to travel around or near the desert went along the fringe of the desert where there were wells, where there were oases, places to stop. It was simply a difficult place to travel. So, having said that, if you're in the north and you want to go south, there's no option. You have to travel through Israel. When we get closer, I'm going to show you another set of maps where we'll look at the actual highways that were built. And we can say that the oldest international highway on the planet was built between Mesopotamia and Egypt. And that road went right through Israel. We call it the Via Maris. That's a Latin word that means the way of the sea. The sea that they have in mind there is the Sea of Galilee. And I'll show you how that works when we get there. But if you just looking at this map, you can see two of the three of the earliest population centers on the planet. And just to the right of that big oval that I've labeled the north is the Indus Valley. This was the original population center for the world. Today, I live in Idaho. Donna and I live on a piece of land that no one has ever lived on before. And if we were to dig here, we wouldn't find much of anything. If I travel east and cross the American continent and go to a place like Plymouth Plantations in Massachusetts, north of Boston, I could probably do archaeology. I could go out digging, and I could find evidence of the earliest European settlers who came to this area 400 or so years ago. And I could find evidence of perhaps of the Indians who lived there before that. If I cross the Atlantic to Europe, I'll stop in London and head south, and I can find things back to the Anglo-Saxon period, back to the time of the Romans even. So maybe 2,000 years in England. If I go just a little farther east, I can stop in Italy. And there I'm going to find things that take me back to maybe 700 or 800 years before Christ. If I cross the Adriatic and stop in Greece, I'll find things there that are perhaps 1500 BC. There's a city called Mycenae, south of Athens, that it's probably 3,500 years old. It's getting older and older and older. If I cross from Greece into Turkey, I'm going to find things that are as much as 2000 BC. But when I get to Mesopotamia or to Egypt, I'm going to find things that are at least 3000 BC and many much, much older. This is the birthplace of all of the civilizations of the earth, and everything is developed from this spot. And you can see that Israel, the biblical location that we're going to work with, is right in the middle of it. There's a reason that God chose this spot to work out his plan to redeem the world. Okay, Israel has always been on the track of any empires that were out to conquer the world. If you're going to build an empire and you live in Egypt, you're not going to walk off into the desert, not very far anyway. You're going to head north. And on your way to fame and glory and wealth, you're going to run over the top of little Israel. That's the story of that place. Okay, let's go on. So Mesopotamia before Abraham. We just spent a little time with Mesopotamia now. You may have a map in your packet, 2-1, the origins of the patriarchs. That Mesopotamia is a term that means the land between two rivers. And the two rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates. This area is a little smaller than the state of California, which makes it pretty good sized. It's a big land area. The Tigris and Euphrates rise all the way in the north in the mountains of Urartu, or Armenia, and they flow through a broad river valley, an alluvial plain, all the way to the Persian Gulf. Archaeologists are convinced that the ancient mouth of the rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, were about 150 kilometers farther north than they are today. When we look at the ancient stuff we find, it's about 150 kilometers north of the modern Persian Gulf. The rivers flood their banks every spring. One particularly big flood happened at which was famous because the first archaeologist who came to Sumer, a British scientist by the name of Leonard Woolley, decreed that this layer was the one associated with the biblical flood. Now, of course, he's wrong. The flood layer there in is probably about 1 meter thick, and so it's a fairly impressive flood. But that's not the biblical flood. The Bible says that was worldwide. The southern part of the valley was called Sumer. The central area is going to be called Babylon, and the northern area, which is Kurdistan, more or less today, was called Assyria. There were great nations all through history who came from this area. This picture in the background is the Ziggurat at the Ziggurat is a temple tower. It's a kind of a platform tower with a large flat area on the top where the temple was built. And we find very few remains of the temples themselves. They were made of mud brick. Here's a map of the Fertile Crescent, and I'll point out some things along this route. I have mentioned Sumer, and that is this area at the very southeast corner of the Mesopotamian Valley. You can see that to the north and west of Sumer, the Euphrates River flows on a more or less southern route with headwaters way up in the Taurus and Kurdistan mountains in the north. The Tigris has a more northern route and ends up in Lake Van in Ararat in Armenia. The valley itself is a little darker color. You can see that on the satellite map. The city of is right there. You can see that little circle coming on, and that little guy, that's the southern possibility for and is most likely to be the correct location of the city of This is the famous place. This is the city with the Ziggurat, and it's fairly well known. Babylon is about halfway up the Mesopotamian Valley. It's close to the modern Baghdad. You can see the city of Baghdad on the road north from the city of Babylon that I have here. So just north of the city of Babylon, the region that we call Babylon is in the same area. Baghdad was built just north of that. Now, there was no Baghdad in ancient times. That's a relatively modern place. The Muslim empire that the Persians built was centered around Baghdad. You can see Assyria farther north, right up against the mountains, and Nineveh and some other important cities are there. Interestingly to me, Nimrod probably founded all of these places. Now, when Abraham came out, he started in certainly went through Babylon, followed that dotted line as far as Haran. You can see the little green circle with Haran, way up in the north at the foot of the mountains on the shore of a lake that I don't remember the name of, is the location of Haran. This was a center for the worship of the moon. And that ends up being fairly important later on. Then Abraham, after the death of his father Terah, took the people who were with him, and they headed south to the land of Israel, to Canaan. They came through Shechem and past Jerusalem, all the way into the desert of Sinai and eventually to Egypt. So ultimately, Abraham describes the Fertile Crescent. You can see the route along the rivers to Haran, and then south just at the edge of the desert. This is the track that would be taken by anyone who had camels. With camels, you can go far enough between water that it's actually practical to stay away from the big cities and go along the edge of the desert. It makes for faster travel. The sheep and goat herds and people traveling with women and children, with donkeys to carry their stuff, don't travel as far every day, and so had to stay closer to water. So Abraham apparently came down the caravan route. Okay, let's take a look at some of this. I'll give you a little background. They're really, really early times. The archaeologists trace Mesopotamian history back to about 7,000 BC. So what we call the pre-Pottery Neolithic era. Now, I'm going to make a note on the dates because I don't want to confuse anybody, but I know I'm going to confuse everybody anyway. But I'll make a note on the dates. All of the dates that are given in the history books prior to about 3300 BC are suspect. I don't take any of them at face value. I use the dates because they're universal in all of the literature. And if you read anything anywhere else, these dates are what you will find. But these are the dates assigned by the secular historians. They believe, first of all, that there is no God, or if there is a God, he's irrelevant. They believe the Bible is a book of mythology and has no significance for history. They believe that evolution happened over a period of multiple billions of years, and that human history is in fact insignificant, dating back a few hundreds of thousands of years. If people lived here for hundreds of thousands or millions of years, I like to ask, what were they doing for all of those years? If, in fact, civilization began, or Mesopotamia began to be inhabited by 7,000 or 8,000 BC, what were all of those people doing for all of the years that they lived there? Did they simply not have families? What were they? What did they do? And why is there so little trace of them? We do find ancient sites, and it's obvious that they're quite old, but I think they can be understood on a much shorter time frame. I'm not going to try to develop that. We're going to use the big numbers because that's conventional, and it's just easier to work with. But let's say that the time before 7000 BC can be called prehistoric. It's not a very scientific term, but it'll do. By the end of the period, by 7000 or so, there were small settlements, villages, cave dwellers, even some small cities. Tools were made of stone. Sometime around 7000 BC, according to this story, pottery was invented. And so we call the period before that pre-pottery. Neolithic means the new Stone Age. Again, as Christians, we don't believe in very much of that, but it's helpful when we start talking about the artifacts that we find. So this little clay god on the left, the piece of pottery, and the clay bowl on the right, all date to prehistoric Mesopotamia. These things are found in the museum in Baghdad. Okay, pottery was invented. We think people learned to make jewelry about this time because we start finding some. There is evidence that people worshipped deities of some sort or another, usually made to look like men or like animals. There's some evidence that they practiced magic. We don't have a whole lot. This place looks kind of lonely, doesn't it? Way in the north is a place called Tepigara. And there are several sites of the Neolithic period in Mesopotamia. These are all in the northern reaches of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, especially along the Tigris in Persia or Iran. Tepigara and Tepijarmo are probably the best known, which means that books have been published. So scholars have actually studied these places a little bit. The Jarmo site has given its name to the period from 7000 to 5800 BC. And the period begins with the domestication of plants and animals, and that allowed real farming and animal husbandry. It ends with the introduction of metals. And again, I have to ask, why did it take thousands of years to domesticate the first animals? Didn't people notice that goats come when you rattle, a bowl of oats. I mean, what took so long? I believe it could be shortened. But anyway, 6 or 7,000 BC, animal husbandry. Finally, we get metals. Okay, very good. The Hasuna and Samara periods happen in the area of Sumer. This ranges from roughly 58 to 5,000 BC and happens down in the very south, the area that today we call the Tigris Marshes. During this time, we find the first evidence of the burial of the dead. So we find tombs, sometimes with bones, often with just the offerings of various kinds. During this period, we find a stamp seal, which is rolled or pressed into clay to mark ownership of a thing. We find molded bricks, which make for much stronger, longer-lasting buildings. Irrigation was begun, which is a very big deal. In some places, we find defensive walls, like that little settlement that you can see in the background has defensive walls around it. We begin to find richly decorated pottery. And then finally, international trade starts happening. So suddenly, right, between 6,000 and 5,000 BC, according to the traditional dating, people finally learned how to do international trade, how to load their stuff onto a camel and take a long walk to sell it at the far end. I always ask what took them so long. I don't believe it took all those thousands of years. It doesn't matter. The Halaf period is noted for beautiful pottery, very richly decorated pottery, and the use of metals. The whole Mesopotamian area passed into the Copper period, what we call Chalcolithic. So from about 55 to 4,500 BC, lots of interesting stuff. This Halafian period in Mesopotamia, in the traditional dating, is a full 2,000 years before Abraham. Even if it's not 2,000 years, it is many hundreds of years before Abraham. The thing for us to understand is that Ur, in the time of Abraham, was already an ancient place. It was a very, very old civilization by the time Abraham arrived. The Ubaid period dates roughly 53 to 3750 BC, and it's most famous for this heap of mud brick that you see in the background. This is called the White Temple at Uruk. Uruk is not the same as Ur, but we're beginning to learn a great deal about the people who lived at this time. They didn't write anything down, but we do find settlements of apparently a few thousand people along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. There were boats with apparently sails. We've actually found in the tombs some model boats, toy boats, with holes where a mast would have gone. So they obviously used sailboats on the rivers. There were irrigation canals during this time that began radiating out from the rivers and out into the surrounding plain. The White Temple at Uruk is the earliest platform temple that we've ever found, dated by its strata. So it came before the ziggurat at Ur or the ziggurat at Babylon. This is the oldest one. It's old enough that perhaps this was the Tower of Babel, but we don't know. We don't really know. The temple here seems to have been built to overlook the community. It was up high. Temples of this sort that we find all over Mesopotamia were not built for group meetings. In other words, a temple is not like a church. The temple was not designed for people to gather together, to worship, to read from scriptures, to have potluck suppers. None of that happened in a temple. The temple was designed as the focus for a religion that related to the kings. So the king was the one sent down from heaven. And he was allowed to make contact with the gods. It's a very interesting thing. The sacred area at the top of the temple is called a temenos, Temenos. Temenos is actually, I believe it's a French word, that it might be Greek, but it was a word first invented by the French archaeologists to describe the platform area. That's the sacred area. The temple itself would be a smaller building within the temenos area, within the sacred space area. And it was divided into an outer room and an inner room, very similar to the biblical temples, holy place and the Holy of Holies. Outside on the temenos in the open air, there was an area for an altar and an area for a basin for washing, just like the Mosaic temple. The tabernacle area had a brazen altar. It had a laver for washing. The concept of sacred space demonstrates an idea that was universal in the ancient world. People understood that the gods are up high and man is down below, and that sin has separated men from God. That a sacrifice is necessary, that some kind of cleansing is necessary, and that on that basis, some sort of fellowship with the gods is possible. All of these ideas are true. They're badly damaged and improperly practiced, but all of the ideas surrounding sacred space in the ancient world are based on the truth that comes down to us from the Garden of Eden. Adam recognized that his sin had separated him from a holy God, and that he was going to have to jump through some hoops in order to attain or maintain his fellowship with God. And that's the basis, the foundation of every form of religion. Now, the downside of Mesopotamian religion at this point in history obviously was the focus on a fertility cult. The pattern stressed the relationship of the gods and goddesses to the fertility of plants and animals. This ancient Mesopotamian religious set of ideas become the pattern for later Canaanite and Greek and Roman religion. When we think of ancient paganism, this is something that has its roots far, far back into the ancient world, and was the mistake that non-believers made in trying to find their way back to God. Paul describes this in the first chapter of Romans. Thinking themselves wise, they became fools and traded in the incorruptible God for images of corruptible men and animals and birds and fish. And that is precisely what was happening at the White Temple of Uruk. So sometime between 3750 and 2900 BC in Sumer is what we call the Proto-Literate period, or the first writing. And here on the very right-hand edge, we see some examples of the very earliest Sumerian pictograms. The pictograms are little pictures that meant something. So let's see if I can find out any of them. And on the right-hand panel, the upper little bit of tablet, the lower left is a foot. Okay, and the foot could mean foot, or it could mean walking, or it could mean traveling. In the right-hand lower panel, there is a hand, and there is a shepherd's crook, and there is something else. Okay, and you just have to memorize what those pictures are and what they mean. So what is a hand? A hand can be a hand. A hand could be open in friendship. A hand with a shepherd's crook could speak of a shepherd's love for his flock or something. And you kind of have to guess. Sometimes we make it up as we go along. But little pictures. The first kind of writing was the actual drawing of little pictures to represent what we're talking about. Later on, this turned into cuneiform. If you want to write a little more quickly than simply drawing little pictures, you come up with some kind of a shorthand. The clay tablet that we see in this middle picture is made by taking a sharpened wedge-shaped stick and poking it into wet clay. Again, we're drawing little pictures. I'm not going to give you an example of this, but we might make half a dozen pokes into the clay, and that little pattern is an individual picture that can be a word or a concept or even a syllable of a word. Oh, okay. The very earliest writing required the scribes, who were the only literate people, to memorize the shapes of each of the ideas. So an individual shape is what we call a logogram. It's the picture for a word. In the modern era, well, really from the time of the Bible on, alphabets have taken the place of the logograms, cuneiform and hieroglyphic. We don't draw little pictures anymore to represent what we're thinking of. We write it out in words, and the words are made up of an alphabet. So when we have 23 or 26 letters, frankly, it's much easier to remember than 2,000 or 3,000 pictures. Developing a vocabulary of 2,000 or 3,000 words in cuneiform would have been a major challenge for anybody ever. But with an alphabet, a child can learn 23 or 26 letters very quickly. In a week or so, most children can learn the alphabet and then can begin to sound out words. And they learn what the words mean, but they can say them even before they know what they mean. An alphabet is a much, much better way of doing things. It took roughly 1,000 years to move from the logogram pictures to alphabetic writing. And I believe that the Semitic people groups, probably Hebrews, were the first to do an alphabet. Okay, the early part of the earliest dynasty that we know of, when kingship came down from the gods, and we actually see history about the kings, is at Ur, sometime around 3000 BC. At first, the kings controlled city-states. These were medium-sized towns with smaller towns and villages surrounding them. And Ur is a good example of this. It probably had a radius of about 60 kilometers at a population density of not too many, perhaps 20 per square mile, about 20 people on every 3 square kilometers. The king would have been a powerful character during this time. The king would have ruled everything in this several thousand person community. He had a large bureaucracy. The bureaucracy would be the people who lived at court. They're in the palace with the king, and depended on the king for their income. During this time, there was tension between the king and the temple, which is fascinating, because at the beginning of the period, around 3000 BC in Ur, it's obvious that the king was also the high priest. By the end of the period, by 2300 or so BC, it's fairly clear that the king had moved out of the temple and occupied a palace nearby. And we can see this in the archaeology. A separate high priest took over the operation of the daily function of the state religion. Between them, by 2300 BC, or just before Abraham, the king and the high priest probably controlled most of the land of the city-state, which was then rented out, in effect, to the peasants. And they worked the land as slaves of the king or of the priests. In the modern era, we've got a group of globalists who meet at Davos in Switzerland every year, who've begun to say, by 2030, you will own nothing and you will be happy, which is exactly what these ancient kings used to say to their slaves: you will own nothing and you will be happy, or we will kill you. It's the same difference. There is an upper class of a relatively small number of kings, priests, and bureaucrats who keep it all running, and a vast class of peasants who own nothing and owe their existence to the king. Not a good thing. The royal tombs at Ur, which is where the artifacts on this page come from, a lot of bronze, a lot of gold. That thing on the right that looks like a harp is covered with gold leaf. This helmet in the middle is copper, and the vase on the right is clay, but covered with a kind of metallic substance. Vast wealth, incredible wealth for this period was owned by kings who were a part of the ruling class. Okay, Akkad, also just before Abraham, became a major power under the first great tyrant. This character in history is generally called Sargon the First or Sargon the Great. And his date is around 2300 BC. We know that he started out in the south and headed north. He founded the city of Akkad or Agad, He probably founded Babylon. Later on, he went all the way up the Mesopotamian Valley and founded the city of Sumer and some others. Most likely, he subjugated these places. He was the original tyrant. He was the original warlord. He was the original great evil dictator who is the type of the Antichrist to come. There's a solid argument from archaeological evidence that demonstrates that Sargon I should be identified with Nimrod from Genesis 10. So Sargon used the Sumerian language for writing, and the Akkadian gods were similar in most ways to the Sumerian deities. The old Sumerian culture wasn't destroyed. It lived on in parallel to the Akkadian culture. During the time of Sargon, there was a shift from royalty owning everything to at least a partial ownership for some of some private property. There's something like a middle class that rose up under Sargon, not the modern middle class that we know of, but a broader group of non-bureaucrat merchants and craftsmen who worked under the protection of the king and were able to initiate trade throughout the region. One of Sargon's sons, Naram Sin, is the word sin, by the way, in the Semitic languages has to do with the moon. So the word Naram Sin means a servant of the moon god. And Naram Sin is the only important descendant of Sargon. He conquered a lot of areas in the north, in the mountains, as shown in the stele on the right side of the screen. There he is climbing up into the mountains, and he considered himself a god. Perhaps nobody else did, but he thought he was a god. Okay, there's a group of mountain people who continued to resist the Akkadian power during the period of Naram Sin. They are called the Guti, and we find a little bit of their stuff right here. This is one of the burial tombs of the Guti in the north. And then the last picture I'm going to show you is from the time of Abraham. Ur 3 is the third layer of the city of Ur, contains this ziggurat. And by the way, this photograph was given to me by one of my students who was in the Gulf War. He was riding on top of a Bradley fighting vehicle that came through Ur, and he saw this and thought it was interesting. And when he brought it to me as a freshman, I recognized what it is. That's the place. That's Ur. That's the real thing. Is that the Tower of Babel? No, probably not, but it looked like that. On the left is something fascinating. This is part of the treasure of Ur. This was in the collection at the Baghdad Museum and is still there today. And this is the ram caught in the thicket. At least that's what I call this guy. Did Abraham know of this particular piece of art? Probably not, but I find it fascinating anyway. Ur-Nammu, around 2100 BC, seems to have defeated the Guti, and he established Ur-3. This is about the time that Abraham would have been here. The oldest law code that we've seen anywhere in the world comes from this period. around 2100 BC. The Ziggurat at Ur is the largest one that we have in Mesopotamia. And it's also during this time that a group of people called the Amorites or Amuru came through the area. They were grazing sheep, taking over in some places, generally being a problem. Okay, Abraham is sometimes called a wandering Aramean or Amorite. The term is used several times in the Old Testament. The term Amorite means Westerner, literally one who travels west. The Amorites apparently came out of Central Asia, places like Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, and the Central Asian republics to the west, that were the area where the Scythians lived and where the Persians came from. These people came out of that area and went west. The Amorite migration takes large numbers of Amorites from Mesopotamia toward Canaan. Abraham is a part of the Amorite migration. Now, the other thing that I want us to understand is that Abraham and his father were also a part of the civilization of Mesopotamia. There was no Christianity in those days. There was no Judaism. As far as we know, there was no monotheistic, God-centered, Bible-based religion. It simply didn't exist. Later on, we're going to see a representative of the true religion, Melchizedek. But Abraham hadn't met Melchizedek yet. When God called Abraham, Abraham was still a pagan. He was still a servant of the king of Ur. He was still an Amorite, worshiping whoever the Amorites worshipped. God called Abram out of an ancient culture to become the father of a great nation. So this is background. I'm going to quit there, and we're going to pick up next time with Abraham as he actually functioned in Mesopotamia. I hope this is helpful for you. I hope we're seeing a little bit of how this background can be helpful in understanding how the Bible actually works. We can put the biblical story into its historical and geographical context. And that gives us more dots to connect, and it makes the story more complete. So next time, we'll continue and we'll actually look at Abraham's life against this broader background. And between now and then, I'm going to say bye-bye for Donna and I, and for young Deborah. Love you all. I can hardly wait to get to someplace warm. I'm coming to either Italy or the Philippines so next time things open up. Bye-bye all. Love you all.
Thank you, Dr. John.
Yowza.
Bye,